This is IBN, the Islamic Broadcasting Network. The following program is sponsored by the Islamic Media Foundation, sharing the guidance of Allah through the broadcast media and the Internet.
Welcome to Family Matters with your host, Mollie Shamma. Because each family matters.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Family Matters. This is Mollie Shamma, and today my guest is Sister Freda Shamma from Cincinnati, Ohio, and we are going to be talking a little bit today about the importance of reading materials for Muslim children, Muslim stories, and Muslim literature. And Sister Freda is with me today because she is the head of a foundation known as Fadel. And maybe, Freda, assalamu alaikum, are you there?
Alaikum salam. I am here indeed.
Okay. Didn't hear you there for a minute. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Fadel and how you guys got started, and we can kind of start with a little bit of background information before we jump too far in there.
Okay, certainly. The project for developing an Islamic curriculum was started at the International Islamic University in Malaysia about 6 or 7 years ago. We worked on it there very intensely for about 3 years, and then when I came back to the United States, the university took a different direction in curriculum, and so I brought the curriculum work back with me, and we've continued it through FUDL, which is the foundation here in Cincinnati. So we're trying to develop a curriculum for kindergarten through 12th grade for every subject, for language arts, for social studies, science, and so on, based on an Islamic perspective.
Now, some people may not understand exactly what you mean by that. How does one look at an Islamic perspective in math, for instance?
Okay. We have to ask what's the source of knowledge and what kind of mathematical principles we can deduce from thinking about the source of knowledge. The source of all knowledge is Allah, and we know that Allah is infinite, that there is no end. And this concept of infinity, the Muslims had it, whereas, for example, the Greeks and the Romans didn't have it because their gods were finite, their gods were limited, and therefore when they thought in terms of mathematics, they thought in terms of limited or finite numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But the Muslims had the concept of an infinite God, and so that led them to think about the concept of infinity. And they developed the numerical system that could express an infinite number of numbers. You know, you just add a 0 to whatever number you have, or you add +1, and you have a new number. There's no end to it. So this is the kind of thing that the principles behind counting or a lot of mathematical processes, the philosophical basis of them goes back to what you think about how the world was created and what's the nature of the world and what's the nature of the creator of the world.
So what you're looking at is sort of a holistic program where every piece of the curriculum is touched by Islamic thought and background.
That's right.
Okay. Now, Fadel is working on the curriculum. What other projects do you guys have right now?
Well, the overall project project is curriculum, but the curriculum is composed of quite a number of different parts. For example, the subject of language arts. Well, first of all, we developed an outline of what should be taught in general in each year of K through 12. But then when we get to, ninth grade, say, and we want to have Islamic literature from a certain period of time that will follow what they're studying in the history class, in the social studies class, well, then we have to have Islamic material from the 9th century or the 11th century or whatever. And so that's not readily available. So we are trying to develop the reading material that could be used with the outline, with the curriculum. So what we're doing right now is really pushing hard to collect appropriate Islamic material and see at what age each piece is appropriate.
So who's involved in helping you with all of the various different research? It sounds like that's pretty complicated to go and try to find Islamic literature from the 9th century, for instance, and then translate it.
Well, fortunately, there's a lot more translated than I originally thought.
Uh-huh.
I thought we were going to have to do all the translation from the Arabic, but quite a number of scholars, mostly non-Muslims, have translated various works of various authors. So it's actually a matter of digging up material that was printed in the 1900s, which is when a lot of the translation work was done, or material that was printed in England. And so it's a matter of having a number of people who are concerned with the project spend their free time looking through bookstores and on the websites and so on for used books in the hopes that we find yet one more piece of important literature. And alhamdulillah, we have been very successful. And sometimes the things come up in very strange places, but alhamdulillah, we are able to collect quite a bit of information.
You're putting together sort of a comprehensive bibliography of works as well.
Right. I mean, part of our project has been to figure out who ought to be read, who are the main literary figures. Because unfortunately, most Muslims, at least that live in this country, don't know their own literary background as Muslims. Because most of the people who came to this country had gone to American schools or British schools in their own countries. And they got, British literature and American literature, but they didn't get Muslim literature. So even when you ask people from the Arab world or people from the Indian subcontinent who are the most famous Muslim writers in the past, they can't tell you. So we have had to develop the bibliography and then try to find the works to go with the authors.
I think it's very interesting because, as some people may know, I have a literature background. And I think even when I studied world literature, something that was considered world literature, the only thing I ever remember reading from the Arab world was probably Arabian Nights.
Exactly.
And that's the only thing you ever hear, but that in the Quran itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only thing that I ever remember, ever being exposed to. And, that's 12 years of public school plus, 4 years of bachelor's degree in English plus another 4 years master's degree. So that's a lot of time to cover and 1 or 2 samples, and that's it.
Exactly. One of the things that we did in Fadl was to evaluate the world literature books that are being published now for high schools. And this same thing runs true. The world history has about more than 80% of it is European and American literature. And then of that 20%, about 5% comes from the Middle East. And of that 5%, about 3.5% is from Israel, Jewish stories. And then of that 1.5%, most of that is contemporary writers who are not Islamically involved, and so you end up having a few excerpts from the Quran, and that's about it. So it's pretty much in keeping with what you had in college.
I just think that's amazing. But I guess in a country that is so Eurocentric here and so egocentric on itself, I mean, any literature program here is going to focus on, what it knows. And one of the things I think is a real shame is that in America, and I think I could be safe in saying in Europe too, that there's very little value given to the rest of the world in general, but to literary works or scientific works. You have to do something pretty outstanding, to be accepted by the Eurocentric and USA-centric people.
It's not just that you have to do something outstanding, but you have to do something that is very Western.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously, you're an English major, so you were taught what constitutes good writing in English.
Right.
And so in order for you to, or anybody with an English background, to say this is good work, it has to meet the criteria that you have learned that's good writing. But that criteria only fits Eurocentric literature. It doesn't necessarily fit literature from another part of the world.
But
I think things are beginning to change. In the public schools, you find a few more multicultural stories, not from the Muslim world, unfortunately, but you find some from Vietnam or China, and a considerable number from the Hispanic world.
Sure, with the Hispanic influence here, there would have to be.
Right. So as the minorities grow in America, then the multicultural material has alhamdulillah, grown with it. And so one of the things we're trying to do through Fadl is to make a book of stories that contain Muslim wisdom and make it appealing and for non-Muslims, and try to get it published by a mainstream press, so that when people look around and say, oh, we have a lot of Muslims in this school district, we should have some multicultural material for those students, there will be something available. Because part of the problem is, even if you wanted to have stories about Muslims or written by Muslims, you might have trouble finding the material.
That's true. That's true. And so the projects that you're working on are not necessarily just for Islamic or Muslim schools, but they are also for the greater education population at large.
Right, absolutely.
Let's take a quick break for station identification, and then we will come back, and I think you're going to read us a story, inshallah.
That's right.
Okay, just a minute.
IBN is your voice. Let us know what you think of our broadcast. Email us at feedback@ibn.net. Or call our feedback line at 703-241-9659, extension 6. Your opinion counts.
And I'm still here with Freda Shamma, and we are talking about the work of Fadl, which is the Foundation for, help me out, Freda.
The Foundation for the Advancement and the Development of Education and Learning.
Thank you. I drew a big blank. Okay. Here in Cincinnati. And I know that one of the projects you're really working on right now is developing a book with Muslim stories, Muslim wisdom. But And I would think that you're shooting for a young audience, but I'm not sure that it's specific to that.
Well, we're actually aiming it rather at middle school.
Okay.
But the Muslim stories, which contain wisdom, are usually enjoyed by quite young children and teenagers and adults and old people. That's the beauty of a good story. Mm-hmm. Everybody enjoys it. One of the things that has really been amazing in collecting the stories is to find what a sense of unity we have, what a real ummah we have throughout the Muslim world. Now we're all divided into different nation states, and that's causing us problems. But when you look at the culture and the literature, you find such strong similarities. And if I can, I'd like to share with you today the main folk character of the Muslim world.
Go on. I know who you're going to say. Freda's favorite character in the world.
That's right.
And he is a character, too.
His name is Joha, and the first time that we hear about him is about the year 700, when one of the writers during the Umayyad period of time referred to him, and so we know that stories about Joha existed even before then in the Arabic-speaking part of the world. When they took the story to Egypt, and the Egyptians adopted Arabic but with their own accent, Joha became Goha in Egypt. And then when he traveled to Turkey, he became Nasruddin Hoja. And then when he went to Persia, and the Persians' literature went on to the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia, he is known there as the Mullah Nasruddin. And he has even traveled as far as China. And so somebody asked me once, well, how do you know that he's the same character in all these places? And the reason we know is because we find some stories that are exactly the same and some that are very similar. For example, in the Arab world, there's a story about Joha, or Goha as I usually call him. He was known as a very wise man in the village, and so one day a scholar came through who was very arrogant and very sure of his own knowledge, and he said, I understand that you claim to have a wise man in your village, and I would like to question him to see whether he's as wise as you say he is. And so they brought Goha, and the scholar said, I'd like to ask you some questions. And Goha said, of course, I'll be happy to answer them if I can. So the man said, all right, how many stars are there in the sky? And, first of all, the first question he said was, where is the center of the earth? And Goha pointed to where his foot was. He said, under my feet. And if you don't believe me, you can measure. Well, of course, he couldn't do that. So he thought of another question. He said, how many stars are there in the sky? And Goha said, as many as there are hairs in the tail of my donkey. And the scholar said, well, how many hairs is that? And Goha said, well, as many as you have hairs in your beard. And if you don't believe me, we can pluck out one hair from the tail of the donkey and one of your hairs until we see whether you both end up with no hair at the same time. And, of course, the scholar didn't like that, and he admitted defeat, and he left. So this is a very famous story in the Arab world. When I went to China this last summer, I ran across a book with all Chinese characters, written in Chinese, with a picture of Goha on the cover. And I asked our Muslim guide to translate the story for me, and lo and behold, there was the tail of Goha's donkey. And in the Chinese version, it says that Goha was a very wise, very humble, very generous man who traveled around on his donkey. And the emperor became very jealous of him because he was loved by everybody. So he had the man brought to his court. Now, this man is known as Afanti in China. And so Afanti came to the court, and the emperor said, I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you can't answer them, then you're going to be put to death. So the first question he asked him was, guess what? How many stars are there in the sky? And Afanti said, as many as there are hairs in the tail of my donkey. So the emperor asked him, how many hairs are in the tail of your donkey? And he said, as many as are hairs in your beard. And the emperor's eyes got red, and he got very angry, and he said, how dare you compare a donkey's tail with my beard? Soldiers, take him off and kill him. And Afanti started to laugh. And the emperor said, why are you laughing? And Afanti said, because I know exactly when I'm going to die. The emperor said, you do? He said, yes. And furthermore, I know exactly when you are going to die. Well, the emperor was afraid of death. And so he questioned him quickly, when am I going to die? And Afanti said, the day after I die. And so immediately the emperor stopped the soldier, said, leave him alone, leave him alone. And Afanti, I wish you live for 1,000 years, because then I live 1,000 years in one day. And he gave him a lot of money so he could live very comfortably and have everything he needed so he would live long. And Afanti took the money and left the palace, and on his way out of town distributed all the money to the poor. So he left as he'd entered, a very simple, very kind, generous man.
So the one difference that I see is that the Afanti in the Chinese story is wise and generous and etc. But the Afanti the Goha that I know from some of the Egyptian stories is more of a clown, I always thought.
Well, actually, because he's a folk character, he can
be both,
change his personality at will, kind of.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So sometimes he's very wise, sometimes he's very foolish. But
sometimes he's just a wise guy, right?
Yeah, and sometimes he's maybe what you would call a buffoon, but he plays tricks only on people who deserve to have tricks played on them. So sometimes he gets people back, for for example, there's a little short story that came from the Middle East, from the Arab-speaking world, where there's a young boy in town who is very disrespectful to Goha and accosts him one day outside the village and says, "You think you're so smart, but you can't trick me." And Goha said, "Oh, I think I might, but I'm a bit busy right now. If you'll just wait here till I come back, I'm sure I can think of some way to trick you." So the boy says, "Well, don't worry, I'm going to wait for you." And so Goha goes on, and hours pass, and the boy is still waiting. So somebody coming into town sees him, and he said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm waiting for that old fool Goha. He thinks he can trick me." And the guy said, "Well, how long have you been waiting?" He said, "Hours." And the man laughed and said, "Son, I think he's already tricked you."
Mm-hmm.
So, he seems to be a fool, but he's actually very wise most of the time.
Well, he certainly is, like I said, he certainly is a character in most of the things. And I think one of the things that's very interesting to me about Goha is that he is sort of a trademark for the Muslim world, and a clue into the humor, the mindset, because mostly, for instance, when I think of Goha, I think of Egypt. I never think of any other country, because I think that a lot of the Egyptians I know have this kind of wry, wise sense of humor. But I've heard that once you can understand the humor of a culture, you can also understand quite a bit about the culture itself. Maybe it is kind of a clue.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing is the Egyptians, if you ask them, will say, yes, Goha was a real person. He was born and raised in Egypt and so on. But when you go to Turkey, they'll say, oh, yes, Nasruddin Hoxha, He was born here in Turkey, and he died here. And they even have a tomb for him that has a huge locked door in front of it. And but you have no trouble getting to the tomb because there's no wall around it. You just walk around the door.
There it is.
Tomb. So, which I think, if there's a tomb for this folk character, that's a very appropriate one.
That's
but
right.
they claim him as their own, and the Chinese Muslims claim him as their own. The Chinese guide told me when I asked him, "Are you familiar with this character?" And he said, "Oh yes, he was born in such and such province of China."
Aha. So not only is he popular, but so popular that even now that he's no longer around, if he ever even was, everybody's vying for him to be with them.
That's right. That's right. He belongs to everybody, but like I said, it's every place where the Muslims have been established for a certain period of time. Everywhere you will find stories about him, although his name may have changed.
We have about 2 minutes left. If people want to help with the Fado project or find out more information, where can they write or call?
They can write to Fadel, FADELEDU at AOL.com. So that's Fadel Edu, like the beginning of education. They can write, and especially if people have stories to share, or they are teaching in a school and would like to try out some of the stories, I would really appreciate hearing from them.
Excellent. And are you looking for writers as well?
Well, writers, yes, but I don't want original stories. I need people who can rewrite the classics into understandable English appropriate for middle schoolers.
Okay. All right. Well, Freda, jazakallah khair for joining us today. It was just a joy to have the Goha stories. I'm sure that, inshallah, if any of our listeners have their kids around, they really will enjoy having this one in the archives, so when it comes up again and again, they can bring their kids to hear your Goha stories, because they really are a treat.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, and inshallah, we'll be back again next week with more Family Matters. Until then, this is Mollie Shamma signing off. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
This program has been sponsored by the Islamic Media Foundation, sharing the guidance of Allah through the broadcast media and the Internet.